on this one, it was a win. I can't think, in fact, of anything more substantial that was done in such a bipartisan manner. But what I would like to ask both of you, Lee, I'll start with you first, and then I'll go to Stephen. But what was the role of state legislators in particular, and governors and states, in moving this process forward?
Well, legislators and governors had been pushing very hard for reauthorization for a long time. Fairly shortly after No Child Left Behind had been passed, we realized there were a number of problems with the law, things that we needed fixed. The waivers helped to some extent, but the whole law needed to be fixed. One of the things that we were able to do is that have the National Conference of State Legislatures and the National Governors Association come together. Both our organizations are bipartisan, and we actually produced a framework that we were able to get both of our organizations to agree to, and you can imagine that's an interesting internal process, but we were able to say, look, this is what is important for states in a reauthorization. I think that helped spark some time in Congress and some space to have a discussion about a bipartisan bill, and I think it was helpful for folks on the Hill that we were able to say these are the main things that states need from a reauthorization, and if you can get there, we can support the bill. And we have so many members, influential ones with the governors, very influential ones with state legislators. We have 7,400 state legislators. And we were able to marshal their ideas and their resources in this plan and, present a challenge to Congress and say states are ready for the flexibility that we need in a reauthorization.
So, Stephen, let me ask you, and once again, going back to the old days when I was in a governor's office, I will tell you I was our NGA representative in West Virginia that worked with the NGA, and I found the work that you did, and I'm sure legislators feel the same way about NGSL, as is absolutely invaluable when we were lost for trying to answer a question or trying to find out something. You were our go-to organization. I know that has not changed over the years. In fact, it's probably increased. But what about your perspective on the ESSA process and how governors were involved in working with members of the state legislatures?
Sure, absolutely. So from a governor's perspective and really from a state perspective, we have all been the incubators of innovation for quite a long time. And so as we thought about what we needed to do in order to advance ESEA implementation, we really wanted to make sure that Congress and stakeholders in DC and the administration knew that from a state perspective, there is no daylight between governors, state legislators, and the variety of other state and local partners that worked with us in order to advance the message that states needed an escape from No Child Left Behind. And so as we move forward, we all talk in broad terms, and both of our organizations, NCSL and NGA, have what are a very robust policy process. And our policies are broad, though. And what we realized we needed to do is, as the incubators of innovation, come up with specific ideas that Congress can use and put forward as bipartisan, as those that would work for states and work for the federal government when it comes to their traditional civil rights role over education in the country. And I think our main mantra is one that you ultimately see in the Every Student Succeeds Act. When Lee and I were working on the first drafts of our plan, we decided that our mantra would be equity and state flexibility can go hand in hand. They are not mutually exclusive. And what we see in ESSA is the strong data that was present in No Child Left Behind that really unearthed many of the disparities in our nation's schools remain. And what's left for states to use to take advantage of that is guardrails that set limits for states, but also allow states to do what's best for students in their state when it comes to making sure that they're taken care of, making sure that the intervention in the schools where those students are attending every day are actually of high quality, and making sure that school improvement is a collaborative process that includes the community and not just a process that states have to choose from a menu of 5 options. Those were our priorities, and that's ultimately what we saw in the ESSA.
Great. Incubators of innovation. Can I get that trademarked? Yeah. That's a good one. No, I like that. So, Representative Collins, I'd like to go to you to just get your sort of initial thoughts on what in your role as a state legislator in Alabama. how important you think that the role of legislators was in terms of ESSA implementation from your perspective. And then I also want to actually jump into a question about Alabama specific, but I'll let you sort of tackle the overarching question on ESSA first.
Thank you. I appreciate being able to participate. I heard about ESSA, and as it was coming through NCSL, through some of the other areas that I'm involved in, I am very pleased at the federal level that we are pushing some of that accountability and responsibility back to the state. As a chairman for education policy, I've tried to keep my ear to the ground and participate in a lot of the discussions that have been a part of that. And so therefore, when our state, Alabama, broke up their implementation committee into subgroups, I was very excited to be a part of one, which was the accountability work group.
That's great.
I'm glad to answer any questions about that. Yeah.
Great. Well, this question may give you the chance to do that, but just in terms of education as a priority in Alabama, how important is it for you and in your work representing your constituents, but also for the state as a whole and what you're trying to accomplish in the state of Alabama?
What I've seen that's been very exciting is that a lot of the requirements for ESSA are actually complementing a lot of the goals and the steps that we're taking to improve education in Alabama. And to see that federal encouragement for what we're already doing at a state level is extremely encouraging that we're moving in the right direction.
Well, that's great. You mentioned the task force, and how involved have you been, or do you plan on being in terms of ESSA implementation in the state?
I've been very involved. I've tried to kind of keep up with what all of the subgroups are doing. I work a lot with our governor's education advisor, and she and I have met and discussed a lot of the different issues. I was very pleased to meet with Lee Posey, one of the members of this group, and get even more information from NCSL on what's going on nationwide in other states. I had passed some legislation on accountability with a school grade law several years ago. As a process for that law to be implemented, we've had a local task force, which has been very similar to how the ESSA implementation has gone. And so as we work through accountability for the ESSA, it's been very exciting to see how that has really walked hand in hand with the recommendations that education stakeholders were already working together to move forward.
Well, that's great. Thank you for that perspective. I would like to chat with all three of you a little bit more about the nature of governors and legislators working together. And I mentioned earlier that, in my opinion, I think in many others, that this was one of the more, passage of ESSA was one of the more bipartisan approaches we've seen in a long time in Washington. But to me, and I learned this, I've worked for Congress and I worked for a governor, and what the difference I found between the two was, while there is a very strong partisan nature often in Congress, you saw a lot less of that when it came to governors. You know, I remember governors of both parties laughing with each other, working together, talking about mutual problems and events. And I've seen the same thing among members of the state legislature, because the very nature of, you know, what a state is dealing with, you're dealing with this. It doesn't have a Democrat or Republican veil on it in many places. It's just a state issue. You're dealing with the same things. You're dealing with a budget. You know, you're dealing with an education system. You're dealing with disasters. And so there is that, I think, a real camaraderie. But I would like to hear a little bit more about how you forge that relationship, you know, among 55 governors, counting the territories, all the various state legislatures. How did you guys do it? I'm going to go back to. I'd like either one of you jump in first, but I'm just curious how that happens. I think it's a lesson to be learned on other issues in education. Certainly, ESSA was vitally important, but down the road, there's going to be many other things that are going to need spurring, and then I think often the states are the ones that are going to have to do that.
Well, I think clarifying your ideas around a couple of core principles. Stephen mentioned the fact that part of our message to Congress was we can provide equity and excellence in education, and everybody, it doesn't matter what party they are, can agree on that. I think there was also strong consensus on the need for state and local flexibility, particularly in regard to what you do with schools and students that are struggling, and those kinds of interventions, what you want to measure to show how well those schools and students are doing. So we were able to get a strong coalition around some of those very basic but important ideas, and they were reflected in the legislation that was ultimately passed and signed into law. And I think they also modeled by the requirement for stakeholder engagement that are part of ESSA, and I was very pleased legislators were specifically included in that for the first time. But governors and legislators aren't even the only stakeholders. There's a whole group of other people that you have to have at the table. But I think by having that process and getting the buy-in to these ideas and to what you want your education system to look at on the front end, it's going to provide a much stronger implementation, and people are really going to be willing to put the time and the energy that's going to be needed for success into it. You can't just implement something and then ask people for their support.
Stephen?
So from our perspective, and I think this is where governors and state legislators agree most, and that is No Child Left Behind, while the intent was truly great, we're growing tired of the 7 to 8% of federal funds dictating how the 92% of state funds that go into schools were being spent. And so while we recognize that we needed to keep some elements of No Child Left Behind, we also recognize that state legislators and governors, they put the funds in the bank account and governors sign the check. And so ultimately, in order for us to have a true state position on what ESSA, or at the time ESEA, could look like, governors and state legislators had to work together. I like to say that when I was in a governor's office, I would have 15 to 20 bills come across my desk, and I know that at least half of them every week would pass. If you're here in DC and you started working on No Child Left Behind reauthorization at the beginning, when they first started talking about it, you worked for 9 years in order to get that done. And so I think bringing that state story of pragmatism, nimbleness, making sure that you're being reactive to the needs of students as they evolve is one that only governors and state legislators can do. They're constantly balancing budgets and trying to make sure that they're changing laws and regulations to address the changing needs of states and every school in their states. And so essentially, we have to make sure that that story was accurately represented to Congress, and also communicate that the flexibility that in order for that to happen needs to be given to states so that we can make decisions that are best for students, making sure that low-income students and minority students and students with disabilities are taken care of. And often the decisions that dictate how well those students are taken care of cannot happen every 16 years or every 10 years. They have to happen annually and every other year to make sure that essentially the needs of those students take priority over the political process.
Well, I'd like to sort of, along that same vein of conversation, I'd like to go back to you for a second, Lee, and also to you, Representative Collins, and talk a little bit more about the interactions as this process goes forward. The law is not passed, but we still have a long way, really, from implementing it in each state across the nation. But in terms of going forward, Lee, I'll go back to you first, and then I'd like to get the representatives' take. How do you, as the NCSL, how do you plan on helping your members as they go through this process over the next 6 to 9 months, and then how do you anticipate that you can best serve them?
Well, I think the first thing is simply that we have provided already a great deal of information about what's in the law, some of the policy options. We have a lot of staff who are specialists in the areas that states are going to be dealing with as they implement this law. So I think providing states with that kind of basic information, I think we also have been presenting this as there are a series of policy buckets that you need to look at and decisions that you'll need to make, and they're around accountability, assessment, and school turnaround, and lots of other issues related to those. So we have said, kind of think about some of the